Great to have you to our quarterly MedStar Quality, Safety, and Risk Management Retreat. We've got another, hopefully, very exciting day planned with a couple excellent speakers talking about some great topics that align with our good to great journey in quality and safety. Our first speaker today is going to talk about transparency. Huge topic in quality and safety. And transparency, as you've heard me say, comes in a number of different ways. It could be transparency amongst ourselves. That's just the ability to share and have conversations in a way that we feel protected and safe in a just culture environment. The ability to raise our hand and say, this is what happened today, and I need to let you know so we can improve our system. It's also transparency with the public, and that means with our patients and families, from things like informed consent to shared decision-making to end-of-life care, but also when things don't happen the way we had hoped they would and the care goes in a direction that we hadn't intended. How do you have those transparent conversations of open and honest communication? And then what our speaker will talk about is how are we also transparent with the public about the quality of care we provide. You could go online, you could go to Consumer Reports, and you could find out all this information about buying a car. You could find all this information about financial rates and interest rates and ability to pick a lender. You can't find that in healthcare. Probably the most important decision we would be making in our lives around the care that we or loved one needs, we don't provide the information to make an informed decision, to make an educated choice. And so it's really a pleasure to have Paul Levy here today to talk about that. I've known Paul for a couple years now, and I really believe that what he did many years ago when he took over at BI Deaconess in Boston and just basically, as they say, open the kimono, open the door. It's just said, this is who we are, here are our numbers, here are our results. Some are good, some aren't so good, but we need to know that. We need to use the data to understand where we need to improve. But just as importantly, our patients, our family members, and the public needs to know it. And Paul went out boldly and challenged all the hospitals in the Boston and Massachusetts area to do similar. And you would have thought he was asking them to do something that was treason. It was amazing to see the pushback and the fights, but Paul led it, and he kept pushing away, and he's been an advocate for transparency and quality and safety in healthcare. So it's a pleasure to have him. He also, as many of you probably follow him, he writes one of the most active, if not the active, healthcare blogs, named Running a Hospital. Although now it's not running a hospital, as Paul is retired and is doing a lot of this stuff in the communities to help hospitals and systems like ours move to the next generation. Paul Levy, like I said, needs very little introduction, but Paul, thank you.
Thank you. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
So do you remember the movie Annie Hall? Who remembers the movie Annie Hall? This is generational right here. Sorry. At the beginning, so Woody Allen is going out with Diane Keaton on their first date. They get out of the car, he says, "Kiss me," in the first 5 minutes of the date. And she says, "Well, why?" And he says, "Well, probably by the end of the date, we're really going to like each other, we're going to want to kiss each other, but we're going to feel awkward about it. So if we kiss each other now, later we won't feel awkward about it," right? Now, what does this have to do with this talk? Well, in your folders, there's actually an evaluation form for this speech. And so what I'd like you to do is fill it out now, because I'd like to be invited back again. But to make this realistic, here's the way it's going to work, okay? Everybody from here over, not including Lynn back there, everybody should put excellent. This table over here, you guys put good. And Lynn, you put poor. And then it will be just like the Press Ganey scores, right? It'll be realistic. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this. Where's my clicker? Thank you. What do I do? This one? Probably this one. All right. I'm here to talk about transparency. This is, you've got all these in your folder. There are many, many kinds of transparency that people talk about all the time. The one I'm going to talk about, for the most part, is the kind of transparency that's helpful to you to get your job done better and for your institutions. And the theory behind my premise is, which I'll get into this in a minute, is that the main value of transparency is for an organization to hold itself accountable to the standard of care it says it believes in. Not what the government wants you to do, not what press gaining wants you to do, not what anybody else wants you to do. Frankly, not even what the consumers might be interested in, although we'll talk about that too. It turns out that transparency, being transparent in real time about your clinical outcomes, works as a powerful force to hold the organization accountable to the standard of care it says it believes in. It's a slightly different view of it, and I'll get to that in a second. All right, first we have to start with the paradox. And here's the paradox that occurs. I hope you will agree with me that the people who decide to become doctors and nurses are among the most well-intentioned people in the world, who devoted themselves, their lives, to alleviating human suffering caused by disease. Any disagreement so far? Okay, good. Extremely well-intentioned. Above average intelligence. Just look around the room, right? Think about the people who go to medical school, nursing school, and so on. You have to be pretty smart to do that. Highly trained, years of training. So the paradox is this. How can it be that that group, that cadre of well-intentioned, extremely well-intentioned people above average intelligence, highly committed, highly experienced, when working together in America's hospitals, represent the 4th or 5th ranked public health hazard in the country in terms of their likelihood of killing someone while under their care? Not having the person die from the disease, but actually being killed in one of our hospitals. A friend of mine once figured out that your chance of being killed while in an American hospital per patient day is greater than was your chance of being killed per soldier day if you were an American soldier during the worst fighting in Iraq. I don't know if that's a meaningful statistic or not, but it kind of says, whoa, maybe it's pretty dangerous in these hospitals. And so the paradox is, how could it be that all those well-intentioned, highly trained, very smart people end up with that result? And I think the answer actually comes from Ethel Merman. Now, this is a clip from my blog. As David said, the blog used to be called Running a Hospital. It's now called Not Running a Hospital. I thought that was a clever switch. And a few years ago, I was talking to our chief of medicine, a wonderful man named Mark Zidell, who we stole away from UPMC to be our chief of medicine. Mark was actually born at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston and came back. And being born at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, he was above average, because I don't know if it's the case in your hospitals, but all of our babies were above average, those born. And this is something, by the way, that I scientifically tested by interviewing grandparents. And 100%, P0001, every single baby born in our hospital was spectacular and beautiful and above average. Anyway, Dr. Zidell was one of those. And one day we were talking about this issue, and he said, well, you know, the problem really was set forth by Ethel Merman. In the movie, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Another generational split here. But very funny movie. And what she said, at one point, Milton Berle, her son-in-law, comes up to her after a terrible accident occurs. And he comes up and he says, oh, it was a terrible thing, but these things happen. And Ethel Merman says, what do you mean these things happen? These things happen because when they happen, we just say these things happen, and that's why they happen. We've got to get control of what happens to us. And Dr. Zidell said to me at the time, he says, you know, I think that's the problem in medicine. And I took it a little further, and what I decided is, particularly among doctors, if I may just talk about doctors for a second, I think doctors, being scientists by training and by nature, believe that there's a statistically irreducible amount of harm that has to occur in hospitals. And therefore, when harm occurs in hospitals, they say, well, these things happen. Now, I think if we analyze that premise, that there's a statistically irreducible amount of harm that has to occur in hospitals, I think we have to be a little more precise and divide that between preventable harm and non-preventable harm. Sure, there's a certain amount of harm that may have to occur in hospitals that's non-preventable, but among the preventable harm, shouldn't the goal be zero? Shouldn't we get past this statistical thing that there's a minimum amount? Or at least say that whatever amount exists today is greater than it could be if we all devoted our time and effort to it, which is, of course, what you folks do all the time. I want to tell a little story about Dr. Zeidel when he arrived at our hospital, because it's illustrative of how things can change. And this will lead to the transparency thing in a minute. So Mark arrives at our hospital and he says, we have too many central line infections here. This is back in 2005 or so, 2004. We have too many central line infections here. And he says this to his attendings and to the residents, and they say, what do you mean, Dr. Zeidel, too many central line infections? You know, the national average is 4.2 per 1,000 patient day, whatever, and we're at 3.8. We're 10% better than the national average. And besides, these things happen. And he says, I don't give a damn what the national average is. We're going to drive this to zero. Zero. Oh my God, cognitive dissonance. The scientists have just been told that they're going to drive this down to zero. They know it's not possible because there's a statistically irreducible amount of harm that has to occur in a hospital. He says, we're going to zero. And because he was the chief of medicine, as opposed to the CEO of the hospital, he actually had authority. I mean, if I had said it, they would have said, yeah, who cares? But he's controlling their salary, their promotions, and most importantly, their space, you know. The final frontier, as we say in a hospital. And he says, we're going to do this. And so how does he go about doing it? Well, he goes about doing it the way Brent James had taught him how to do it, because Mark had taken the course with Brent James at Intermountain Health about how to apply the scientific method to process improvement. Isn't it interesting? You have to teach doctors the scientific method for clinical care when they can do it so well in their laboratories. But they're actually not trained in this in medical school. But they love it once they start getting involved. He says, well, first we're going to do this. We're going to agree on a protocol that we're going to follow for inserting and maintaining central lines and withdrawing central lines. And he assigns a couple of his residents to do some research. He says, go out and find the best methods for this. They were pretty excited because their chief sent them out on this assignment. They came back a few days later. Dr. Zeidel, we figured out the best way to do this. He said, good, let's train everybody. So they teach everybody in the protocol. Seems like a good idea. Because if you just do it the way you did it, based on what you were taught, it means that there are 100 different ways of putting central lines in the hospital. And by definition, if there are 100 different ways of putting it in, they're not based on evidence. Maybe one of them is, maybe two, but not the other 98 or 99. So we start training people, which is good. Using the simulation center, real-time training with patients, the whole thing. And then he did an interesting thing. He kept track of the numbers. Wow. No one had really done much of that before. You know, it was kind of informal. He kept track of the numbers and started telling everybody involved in this what the numbers were, and then decided that every time there was a central line infection, it would be treated as an adverse event, and a root cause analysis would be done to determine what went wrong. Now think about that. Before this, these things happened. They weren't even adverse events. They were barely noticed. And all of a sudden they rise up to the category of adverse events. Do the root cause analysis. Is it something wrong with our training? Is it whatever it is? Turned out a lot of the ones we were seeing were where the lines had been inserted at another hospital in the community and the patient was delivered to us. And so they actually had to make a decision about, do we take a line out and put it in the correct way once the patient gets here? You know, there's a balancing act on that. Anyway, the numbers started going down. Oh, then the other thing is someone said, you know, Dr. Zeidel, this is a great idea, but to follow this protocol, we need a set of supplies and equipment to do it right. And if I'm in a hurry to put a line in and I go to the supply closet and I have to spend 20 minutes looking for all these things, what do I do? So what does he do? He calls in the supply department from the hospital. He says, can you guys make us a kit that has everything we need so that when someone needs to insert a central line, they go to the supply room and they pull a bag off and it has everything they need, the mask, to this, to that. Sure, a week later, that exists. So that excuse disappeared. So I'm watching all this, and first of all, I'm impressed with this statement by Mark. He says, we're not going to benchmark ourselves to the national average or a 10% improvement over the national average. There's no virtue in benchmarking yourself to a substandard norm. Our goal is zero. Zero. Simply put, zero. Eliminate. Don't benchmark. So I'm watching all this happen, and I'm the CEO, and I'm not trained, just by the way, I'm not trained in medicine at all. My background is in economics and city planning and energy, and at one point I ran the Boston area water and sewer system. That's perfect training for a hospital, right? Sewer system. It certainly made a connection between me and the GI people that's hard to explain and while people are eating their fruit salad. And anyway, so I'm watching all this go on, and I was extremely impressed. I was impressed with the goal. I was impressed with the way the protocol was established, with the way the training was done, bringing in other departments of the hospital to facilitate it. I was impressed with the record keeping that was going on, which was real-time record keeping. Every month, the numbers would be circulated to people. And I was so impressed that I decided I would tell this story on my blog. So this is back 2007. This is part of a series. I started posting our infection rate, our central line infection rate, in real time on my blog, saying, this is really good. Why did I do this? Well, I was proud of what we were doing. It was simply that. But then I noticed there were two reactions when I started doing this. Reaction number one was people were proud of the fact that I was proud of them. It made them feel good to be recognized by the leadership of the organization. That's nice in itself. The other thing I noticed, which was even more interesting, was that emails were traversing the organization. Do you know Levy's writing a blog? Do you know he's writing about our central line program? Do you know he's posting our numbers in real time? Maybe we should try even harder to do better. And it was that moment, I like to joke now, that I invented transparency as a management tool. Okay? So what's going on? These numbers are being posted for the world to see. Is the world watching? No, truthfully. Maybe some other hospitals around town are watching. Are consumers watching? Are consumers making decisions about which hospital to go to based on the rate of central line infections? I doubt it. But our own people are watching, and they know the world can watch. And by some deep, dark psychological mechanism, it makes them want to try harder. Now, Peter Senge wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline about and part of the book talked about this, about the idea that by posting a standard for the organization for the world to see, and that by posting your progress relative to that standard, the delta between the current state and the desired future state acts like a rubber band that pulls the organization up to the goal. He calls it establishing creative tension in an organization to meet a high standard, an audacious standard. And that's really what transparency is about. It's not about consumer choice. There's no evidence that consumers, when numbers are posted on websites, actually use it to make their decisions about which hospital to go to, thus far. Maybe that will change. By the way, the proof of this is when Bill Clinton needed his heart surgery. He was in New York City, and New York State actually posts the cardiac mortality rates of the various hospitals. And of course, he went to one that actually had a high mortality rate. So obviously, he was not using that data to make his decision. There is a theory that Hillary used it. But I don't think we want to get involved in those family issues. I actually worked for Bill in Little Rock for a couple of years. I was energy secretary in Arkansas, so I could see it happening. Anyway, what it is we can talk about another day. But the point is, this isn't so much about consumer choice just yet. This is about holding ourselves accountable to the standard that we believe in. The standard was not a standard set by the government. It was not a standard set by the administration of the hospital. It was a standard set by the chief of medicine. Now, he had talked to his other clinical leadership about it, but it was a standard they believed they could achieve. Now, around this time, as David suggested, around this time, there was a lot of talk about this that I was doing. It was pretty unusual. I was new to medicine. I didn't know you weren't supposed to do this. I didn't know why you shouldn't do it, but I learned you shouldn't. In fact, at the bottom of this blog post, I actually said, you know, if I can post these numbers for our hospital, why can't the people at Mass General Hospital and Brigham and Women's and the others in Boston? This was not well received. Shocking, huh? Shocking. Who does he think he is, they would say, of me? You know, so I'm just some sewer guy posting numbers. He's trying to make us look bad. Here I am posting the number of people we're killing, and somehow it's going to make MGH look bad. And the one I loved best was, he's just trying to get a competitive advantage. Now let's think about that. First of all, this is America, and what's wrong with a competitive advantage? But for those of you who have some background in marketing or advertising or have viewed that world, let's try to imagine a marketing campaign around posting central line infections. Full-page ad in the Boston Globe. Good news, we killed 3 fewer people last month. I don't see that as an effective marketing campaign. But that's what I was being accused of at the time, when all I was trying to do was express some pride in our folks and to give this incentive for us to do better. But it did cause some of my board members to wonder what was going on. Why are you posting these numbers? Aren't they going to be embarrassing to us? Was the response. And you can understand that. The board is a group of lay people, lawyers, accountants, real estate people, other successful business folks in the world. And most businesses do not post stories about where they're failing. And so they were applying their view of the world and saying, well, why are you doing this? So we held a retreat for our board where we taught them how to govern quality and safety. They knew how to govern finance before, but they didn't fully understand that part of their fiduciary responsibility as a board related to the quality of care that we gave to patients and to the community. So we did a retreat. We brought in Jim Conway. Many of you know Jim from IHI. We brought in, I always forget his name. He was the chairman of the board of Cincinnati Children's at the time, talking about what they had been doing. We brought in some other folks. And at the end of the meeting, I said to the board, look, your job as a board is to establish the standard of care that you want us as a hospital to deliver to the community. So tell me what standard of care you would hold me and our clinical leadership accountable to, and how you'd like us to get there. Well, they decided that what we should do is to adopt a goal of eliminating preventable harm in our hospital over a 4-year period. And as part of that goal, to post for the world to see on our corporate website all of the cases of harm that occurred in our hospital during that quarter, number and category of cases. This was pretty audacious. So eventually it showed up on our, I'll show you on our website this way. But after the retreat, about 2 months later, we had the formal board meeting at which they were going to vote on this elimination of preventable harm and transparency of clinical outcomes. And 3 questions arose after they'd had a little chance to think about things. First question was, do we have to call it harm? Because one of the board members said, harm sounds like taking someone with a baseball bat and hitting them intentionally. And we don't do this intentionally. Can't we call it something else? And I said, sure we can. We can call it what I call it in my speeches, maiming and killing. They said, let's stick with harm. Second question that came up. Do we have to show the numbers? Why don't we put percentages? Because the number of cases of harm is actually pretty small out of the total. It's not fair to us to post 60 or 70 or whatever number of cases. Can't we do 0.001%? I said, sorry, that doesn't work. It doesn't work because we want to personalize the harm that occurs. We want to remind ourselves all the time that when we hurt someone, it's somebody's mother, father, sister, or brother, or child. If we do a percent, we'll forget that. And you could almost see them sigh and shoulders slump in the meeting as I said this, because they know they're getting trapped into the result. Finally, someone says the thing that they really were nervous about, which is, what if we don't succeed? What if after 4 years we're not at zero? Won't we be embarrassed as an institution? At that point, that same Dr. Zeidel, the above average Dr. Zeidel, stood up and he said, look, I think we can succeed. But even if we get close, if we don't quite get to zero, there will be several dozen people every year who walk out of our hospital instead of dying in it. And I think that's worth doing it. And they voted unanimously to do it. Pretty brave, huh? So if you go to the BI, if it's still there, I've left, so I hope it's still there. If you go to the BID website and look under quality eventually, you'll see a series of charts like this that show by calendar quarter the number of cases of harm by category. Here's central line infections, surgical site infections, and so on, listing for the world to see. Does the world go and watch this? No. Does the staff look at it? You bet. Does it incent them to want to do better? Does it establish the creative tension that Sanghi talks about? Yes. Does it also mean that when adverse events reports come through, besides analyzing what went wrong, is the question raised, was this preventable? You bet it does, every time. And preventable comes in two categories in our hospital. One is, was the standard of care followed? The accepted standard of care followed? If not, why? What's the root cause analysis? But then we made an even harder test for us, ourselves, which was, is the current standard of care adequate? Think about that. So here's one single hospital. Something goes wrong, a particular patient. We do the analysis, standard of care was followed, and somebody says, is that the right standard? Shouldn't we be doing some research to see if we can do it better? It's a real hard burden to put on yourself as an individual institution, but it's a nice one in that it is totally, I mean, we were an academic medical center. It was totally consistent with the academic mission of the place, which isn't just clinical care, but it was research and teaching as well, and trying to stretch the boundaries of medical care. So it was an intensely engaging experience for the faculty to talk about adverse events. At that point, it wasn't just some clinical matter. It was a research opportunity as well. It was an academic opportunity. So that's what we did. Now, there are implications of transparency. And one of the implications is you can't hide and you don't want to hide. July 2008, a patient woke up from orthopedic surgery on her ankle and looked down and said, why is the bandage on my right ankle instead of my left ankle? I'm sure this has never happened in any of your hospitals. What is it? Around the country, I think there are 2 reported wrong site surgeries per week in the US, more or less, I think is the number. Luckily, this was, oh, by the way, it was at this moment that her surgeon realized he had operated on the wrong ankle, because she woke up, looked at him, and said, why is it on my right ankle? He immediately called me and his chief to report it. Luckily, this was a fairly minor wrong site case. Her tendon was now a little tighter in her ankle than it had been before, but it wasn't like the cases you've heard about with the wrong breast, the wrong testicle, or that poor guy in Minnesota or Wisconsin a couple years ago with kidney cancer where they took the wrong kidney out. You know, you imagine things. People out there in the world don't understand why this happens. And what had happened in this case? Well, the doctor had failed to take a timeout before the case. There were other things that I'll tell you about in a second, but the case was brought to our clinical chiefs. It went through the normal process and then up to our medical executive committee. And there were many, many lessons from this case. And we had to decide what to do about this. And so we suggested to the chiefs that maybe we should send an email to everybody on the staff telling them about this case and that we were going to begin a process of learning from it and improving our systems as a result of this case. Within 5 minutes, 13 clinical chiefs of service agreed unanimously that yes, we should send an email to the entire staff about this case. Now let me just explain the Boston healthcare market to you. You send out an email to 6,000 people at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital. 10 minutes later, 50,000 people in the Boston medical community have it. Everybody at MGH, the Brigham, and everywhere else. 20 minutes later, the whole world has it, especially the local newspaper and so on. So this is not something that's going to keep quiet when you announce it. But once again, we felt that it was an important thing to do. I've now given talks around the world to tens of thousands of people, and I've asked people from hospitals all over the world, in which of your institutions would you broadly announce to the institution that there's been a wrong site surgery that's occurred? Thus far, 3 people around the world have raised their hand in London at a presentation there, and I think it's because they misunderstood the question. For the most part, it doesn't happen. And I will tell you, in our organization, if this had occurred 6 years earlier, and we had suggested to the chiefs that we publicize the case, it also would have taken 5 minutes to decide, but the answer would have been, hell no. This is too embarrassing. So this is a sign of the cultural shift that had occurred in our organization during a 5 or 6 year period, that people not only felt comfortable with clinical transparency, but they felt it was essential to achieve the goals that we had set forth for ourselves, that we needed to learn from these cases. Now, I just want to take a couple minutes, just because I know you'll love this since you all do these root cause analyses. What actually went wrong in this case? All right, the surgeon forgot to do the timeout. Why did he forget to do the timeout? Well, this was a complicated ankle surgery that he hadn't done in a while. He studied up for it. He was rehearsing it in his head as he went into the OR because he wanted to do a good job. Can't blame him. Distracted by that, forgot about the timeout. So why didn't somebody else in the OR say something? Well, the anesthesiologist in her previous case had had a near miss. She had almost administered the wrong medication to a patient with potentially fatal consequences, but caught herself at the last moment. She was still stewing about that case. You can understand that, but then you'd say, well, why didn't she kind of get it off her chest and talk to some of her colleagues about that? Well, because as you probably know, if a doctor admits that he or she has made a mistake or almost made a mistake to one of his or her colleagues, the response is usually derision. It's certainly not sympathy. Doctors seem to be trained in ways that I don't understand not to be nice to one another when someone admits a mistake. It's taken as a sign of weakness, even though in their head they're saying, there, but for the grace of God go I. But they're not going to treat their colleagues that way. So this doctor, a very good anesthesiologist, had felt that she could not share that experience of the near miss with her colleagues. The result of that is the same result you or I would have, which is you'd stew over it over and over and over again. She's in the OR for the next case. The timeout doesn't happen. She doesn't even notice it's not happened. The resident in the room, what does he know? He's on a rotating residency throughout the Harvard hospitals, each of which has a different protocol, pre-surgical protocol. So he doesn't even know whether something right or wrong is going on. The circulating nurse who's supposed to document that the timeout has taken place had to leave the room briefly to get something, came back, the case had begun. Therefore, he assumed the timeout had taken place. Therefore, he checked the checklist, timeout. After all, a checklist is there to check, right? He checked it. He assumed that it had taken place. Wow, whose fault is this, right? By the way, around this time, one of my trustees said to me, what are you going to do to punish this doctor? I said, well, nothing. He said, but he didn't follow our process, our procedure. There's nothing I could do to punish this doctor that is worse than he already feels. Trust me, he's a great doctor. He's harmed a patient. He took an oath to do no harm. He feels awful. If you're worried about prevention, deterrence in the future, don't worry, he'll never do this again. And then one of our senior doctors said, and if we want to establish an environment in which people report their errors and their near misses, the fastest way to push that underground is to start punishing people who do. And the board member said, well, okay, but in my field, if someone were to make a mistake like this, they would be severely punished. Guess what his field was? Investment banking. Yeah, right, punishment. Yeah, punishment. We give them bonuses when they do, when they create things that cause the economy to crash. Anyway, just one more aspect of this case, because I know you'll find this fascinating. The correct limb was marked and draped. Why didn't the doctor look for the mark? Well, here we get to a phenomenon that you all know is called normalization of deviance. What's this about? Well, the prime example is the Columbia Space Shuttle that burned up coming into the atmosphere when one of its heat tiles was damaged during the takeoff by a piece of foam that fell off the booster rocket and cracked the heat tile, right? That voyage of the Columbia was not the first launch of the space shuttle in which, when it took off, foam fell off the booster rockets and was flying around. The first time it happened, the NASA engineers said, what's that foam doing? It's not supposed to break off the booster rockets. Why is that happening? Oh, we can't figure it out. Well, it doesn't seem to do any harm. The second time, same thing. Third time, they discovered that a piece of foam this big, traveling 150 miles an hour, has the momentum of a cinder block. And when it hits a ceramic tile, it will break it. And the astronauts perished as a result. Normalization of deviance is when the substandard becomes the standard. How does that relate to this case? Well, for several weeks or maybe months before this case, there was a shortage in the pre-op area of the indelible markers that are used to mark body parts. And so people being very task-oriented invented workarounds, and the workaround, if I may borrow this as a second, was to use these things, ballpoint pens, here, you can have that back, to mark body parts. Guess what happens to a ballpoint pen marker when you put betadine on it to clean the limb? It washes off. Surgeons had become accustomed over several weeks and months to expect not to see a visible mark on the limb. And so when this surgeon didn't see a mark on the limb, he didn't think anything of it, even though the other leg was marked and draped. Such is the nature of these things. We learned from all this. I'll skip the details if you want. You could go to the blog. But basically what came out of this was a revised protocol for timeouts and other aspects of what was going on in the ORs. And and some of the most recalcitrant doctors, surgeons, who hadn't really believed in doing timeouts, who always would say, this will never happen to me, came around. And in fact, several of them participated in the video training materials that were used as a result of this. And when I later talked to the committee that was working on the revised protocol, I said, did it help you that we publicized this event several months ago? And they said, absolutely, absolutely. The transparency around it made everybody understand that it was a serious matter. It frankly also embarrassed them, and it made them want to do better. It was Peter Senge's thing again. It made them want to do better. The result of all these things, we did the same thing on ventilator-associated pneumonia. You've seen these kinds of numbers. You've experienced them too. Real numbers saving real lives. Zidell was right. There were several dozen people after doing this for a few years who would walk out of our hospital instead of dying in it. People who previously would have died and we would have said these things happen. They would not have been adverse events. They would have been a patient in the ICU getting pneumonia on a ventilator, and people would have said these things happen. And instead, over a couple years, over 700 cases of pneumonia were avoided. 30% mortality rate, more or less. couple hundred lives saved. A lot of dollars saved. Reduced the length of stay in our ICUs by 20% also, creating capacity. Instead of having to build out a new ICU, we saved all that money. Our CFO really liked this because hospital CFOs don't like to spend money. You've probably seen that. So it helps on the financial side too, but I'm not here to talk about the financial side except to point out that there's a virtuous relationship between quality and safety and finances. But we were doing this to save lives. Now, key aspect, transparency. Old data are valueless. When I say valueless, I don't mean that they have a little value. I mean they have no value. What does it tell you that 2 or 3 years ago your infection rate was X? It doesn't tell you anything. You want to know where you are today. You want to know that you're improving based on your past performance, but don't tell me your past performance from 2 or 3 years ago. It's irrelevant. That's ancient history. That's the Ice Age. Let's take a look at the consumer websites. Here's the famous one. Go through the footnotes sometime and see what data they're using. This is CMS data they're using, first of all, which has its own problems, but it's 2 or 3 years old. If you believe in transparency as a way for consumers to make decisions about where they want to go to hospitals, this doesn't tell them squat. I just want to tell one story about this fellow, Tom Botts. One of the issues we have to deal with in hospitals is when a mistake occurs, we have to deal with the issue of blame because there's a tendency in our society and even in the medical system to blame people when mistakes occur. The truth of the matter is when mistakes occur, for the most part, I'm not talking about gross negligence, they could have happened to anybody. In fact, when you review a case and you come up with that conclusion, it could have happened to anybody, it indicates that there's a systemic problem underlying the mistake that occurred that needs to be solved. At that point, the leadership of the organization has to take ownership of that mistake. An example of this is Jeanette Erickson at Mass General Hospital. When a nurse makes an error and reports it to Jeanette, she's the chief nurse, Jeanette's first question is, did you mean to do it? The nurse says, well, of course not. Jeanette says, good, that's all I wanted to know, because if you made this mistake, it could have happened to anyone. It's my job to understand the systemic problems, the training, whatever we need to do to fix this. Go back to work, and we're going to get to work on this. Tom Botts, Royal Dutch Shell, is the prime example of this in my mind. Tom was working in the oil rigs in the Gulf area. A couple guys were swept off an oil rig, and he was the one who eventually had to call their wives and explain to them that they'd given up the search and rescue mission, that they were dead, presumed dead. He was later promoted to be in charge of all the oil rigs, and he said to himself, I never, ever want to make that kind of phone call again, because it's a terrible phone call to make. He instituted for Royal Dutch Shell the best safety program in the oil industry, notwithstanding that 2 men on an oil rig in the North Sea went to a portion of the rig they weren't supposed to go to and were killed. Now, Tom could have blamed them, because these were trained people who went to a portion of the oil rig where it says, no admittance, don't come here, and so on. They were clearly at fault. He said, no, it's my fault. I was arrogant to think that my safety program was because it was the best, because I was benchmarking myself to a substandard norm, that it was the best, it was good enough. It was not good enough. And he got his whole senior team together to revamp the program that was already the best in the industry. Think about the message it sends to the organization as a whole when the leadership says, this is my problem, thank you for telling me about it. I value what you have to say. Whenever you see something like that in the future, please let me know. This isn't about blaming you. This is about being hard on the problem and not on the people, as we like to say. think about that as a message going forward. So it's not just transparency, it's how the data, how the information is used. You folks are doing some great things here, and I'm incredibly impressed. I have a couple slides in your package about other places that are doing similar things. You're not alone in this field. You are in the minority still, but you're not alone in terms of what you're trying to do in terms of quality and safety. University of Michigan, they want to eliminate hospital-acquired infections. There's a group of children's hospitals in Ohio that like to say, we compete on everything, but we don't compete on quality. They share what they're learning on quality, and they're doing marvelous things. And I'm sure they'd be happy to come and talk to you about what's going on. So, to reiterate, here's from my point of view, the value of transparency. It acts to establish a creative tension for the organization that helps the organization hold itself accountable to its own standard of care. Are you willing and able? Here's the thing, some of the things I think you need to think about. We decided on central line infections. This is well before a lot of the publicity about central line infections. You have the expertise in the organization to decide what's important. What are the clinical priority areas? Do you have the systems in place to capture the data? Are you willing to publish that data in real time for the world to see and for your own people to see? Do you have systems in place to act on what you've learned? And do you have a learning environment? Now, this last cultural point is the one I want to make. And this all comes down to girls' soccer. Girls' soccer. Okay? Got your attention there? You're going to get a book in a little while about this. I've been coaching girls' soccer for 23 years. And what I've discovered over the years is that what works in coaching girls' soccer works in running hospitals. Now, I don't think this is a statement about the emotional maturity of the two groups of people, although might be, I'm not sure. But it is a statement about the learning condition and what it takes to learn. So I just want to tell you one little story, it's in the book, but one little story to illustrate this. Because I think what we do when we're professional people and we've learned our material in a certain way, we think we can push it out to the rest of the world in that way, and it will take. And I don't think it does. I think we have to think about our pedagogical approaches a lot more. So, any soccer players in the room? No. Any soccer moms and dads? All right. Well, let me tell you about this game, okay? Soccer, it's played on a field. There are two teams, there are two goals, there's a ball. You play each other, right? Okay. The most important skill in soccer is to control the ball when it comes to your foot. The reason for that is if it bounces off your foot when it comes to you, the other team will get it and do something against you that you don't like. Okay, got it? It's the most important skill. So I'm there with the 12-year-olds one day, and I'm saying, girls, the most important part of this game is to control the ball when it comes to your feet. Oh yeah, coach, sure. And I said, but the most important part of controlling the ball when it comes to your feet is to think about it as it's rolling towards you. Think about what you're going to do with it before it gets to you, because if you wait till it gets to your foot, it's too late. You would understand that neurologically. You can't send a signal from your brain to your foot, but if you wait till the ball's there, you've got to anticipate. Just like a baseball player starts a swing early, right? Got it, girls? Oh yeah, I got it, no problem. I said, let's try it out. So I throw a few balls out. I say, so think about the ball, about what you're going to do with the ball before it gets to you. 3 seconds later, a ball comes rolling towards Margaret, and without thinking about it, she boots the ball into the woods. Not even on the field, into the woods next to the field. And I say, Margaret, you weren't thinking about the ball before it got to you. She said, oh yeah, coach, I was thinking about it. I just hadn't reached a conclusion. Okay? So what's the issue here? The issue here was, this wasn't Margaret's fault. This wasn't Margaret's fault. This was my fault. There's a great basketball coach named John Wooden who used to say, you haven't taught until they've learned. Oh, yeah. How often do we think we've imparted knowledge by saying something to somebody else? Look what I did with the 11-year-old girls. I was trying to teach them a physical skill with a didactic approach. First of all, they're 11-year-old girls. They don't listen to lectures very well. Secondly, I'm trying to teach a physical skill by explaining it. Instead, we should have invented some games and things like that. I should have had them invent some games that they would come up with to learn how to do it. Part of our problem in healthcare, I think, is that many of you and your colleagues, doctors in particular, are trained didactically. And they get good at learning that way. And then they think they can impart that knowledge to others just by saying it. Do this, do this, do this, do this. And then they're shocked when it doesn't work. And those of us in the quality and safety arena, I think, often do the same thing. So we have to think about the pedagogical approach we use. How do we create experiences? And very often it has to be tangible, physical experiences, whether it's simulations or whether it's discussions or whether it's role play. I find role play is very useful to teach these lessons. And we also know that you have to teach them over and over and over again, because we're talking about breaking bad habits. So in this light, I think transparency has its role, because if you can't see the numbers, if people don't get a visual cue back as to how things are going in real time, then they can't keep track of how well they're learning and how well the organization is learning. But it's not the end-all and be-all. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. And the final point I want to make this morning is we've talked about how you're doing when bad things happen. The real test, I think, is how well do we do for near misses. For every adverse event that occurs, the research is it's either 10 to the second or 10 to the third real near misses. Those are the ones that are the gold mine. Those are the ones that show you the real systemic problems in the organization. So as you move along, I'd suggest to you build up your capability to capture those near misses as well as the adverse events, because they'll tell you a lot. Okay, David, I think I'm done for now. Thanks for your attention.